A vapid and hollow charade. The woman who now sits before the Judiciary Committee to see if she'll be the next Supreme Court Justice, back in the early 90s, she was a staffer to that very same Judiciary Committee. And in 1995, she famously wrote a book review deriding the confirmation process as a vapid and hollow charade. She argued that Supreme Court nominees ought to stop pretending they don't believe in anything, that they don't have views on anything. She said they should talk openly during these hearings about who they are. Well, now on day 2 of her own Supreme Court confirmation hearings, Elena Kagen is as clammed up as nominees ever are. Forthcoming about her own views, she is not. She says she has changed her mind about the wisdom of that. But until today, the question remained unanswered. 15 years later, 15 years after she wrote the vapid and hollow charade thing, does she still think that confirmation hearings for the nation's highest court are vapid and hollow? Does she still think the confirmation process, the one she's going through right now, is a dumb process? Watch this.
So far, has the hearings been what you thought they would be?
I'm not sure I had, I'm not sure I exactly pictured it, so.
Let's try to go back in time and say you're watching these hearings and you were critical of the way the Senate conducted these hearings. Are we improving or going backwards? And are you doing your part?
I think that you've been exercising your constitutional responsibilities extremely well.
So it's all those other guys that suck, not us, right?
He said suck. For the simple reason that Senator Graham of South Carolina said the word suck during an official Senate proceeding. That was perhaps the most exciting moment from day 2 of the Elena Kagen Supreme Court confirmation hearings today. But whether or not the Kagen hearings are vapid or hollow, and whether or not they, to quote the senator, suck, both sides continue to use these hearings, not so much as a referendum on Elena Kagen, because everybody pretty much assumes she's going to get confirmed, but rather as a teachable moment, a chance to make a broader case to the country about the courts. As we talked about on the show yesterday, Democrats are really desperately trying to make these hearings a showcase for how radically conservative the current Roberts Court is. And Republicans are trying to make it about how liberals are scary. In so doing, they seem to have given up on trying to make it seem like Elena Kagen alone is the scary great liberal threat to democracy. Instead, they have decided to attack a judge she used to clerk for. You might have heard of him.
Throughout her career, Ms. Kagen has associated herself with well-known activist judges. She clerked for Judge Migva and Justice Marshall, each well-known activist.
Justice Marshall's judicial philosophy, however, is not what I would consider to be mainstream.
Thurgood Marshall was, of course, a famous lawyer for, among other things, having won the landmark civil rights case, Brown versus Board of Education. But it's more about his judicial philosophy that concerns me.
He might be the epitome of a results-oriented judge.
He considered himself a judicial activist and was unapologetic about it.
Joining us now to discuss the Republican resistance to Thurgood Marshall joining the Supreme Court 17 years after Thurgood Marshall left the earth is our friend Dahlia Lithwick, senior editor and legal correspondent for Slate Magazine. Dahlia, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
What is the Republicans' beef with civil rights icon and legal legend Thurgood Marshall?
Unclear. I mean, you heard a lot of it in those clips. He seems to epitomize the sort of loosey-goosey, make it up as you go along, fly by the seat of your pants, pot-smoking hippie judge that they want to suggest all liberal judges are. I mean, certainly today, in some sense, was even worse. John Kyle kept saying, you know, Marshall's whole judicial philosophy could be characterized by the notion that you, quote, do what you think is right and let the law catch up. You know, it sounds so unconstrained and terrifying. And so I think because they can't figure out what to say bad about Kagen, they keep talking about Marshall as though she's the same hippy-dippy, pot-smoking. She's not. She's anything but that. But I think they sort of feel like maybe people will confuse the two in their minds.
The amazing thing, though, is that it does, I mean, even for people who don't pay attention to judicial matters, I mean, They renamed BWI, the Baltimore-Washington International Airport, after Thurgood Marshall. He's a legitimate civil rights icon among the very small pantheon of universally recognized civil rights icons in this country. I mean, I know that you're not here to do political analysis, but it does seem weird that people would expect us, that Republicans would expect us to think pot-smoking hippie and not guy who airports get named after, right?
No, it's a very, very mysterious attack, and for what it's worth, Rachel, it really ramped down today, whereas you had so many references to it yesterday. I mean, many more references to Thurgood Marshall than Barack Obama. Today, it was much milder. I think already there's been some blowback in some sense that you maybe don't want to antagonize every African-American over a nominee who's a white woman, you know, who isn't even there's no reason to go the wise Latina route with her because she's a white woman. So I think there may be some sense that this was badly misplayed.
But you do think that the questions about Marshall reflect a lack of a real beef with Elena Kagan on part of the Republicans in the Senate?
I mean, she's been questioned about her relationship with Marshall. She was questioned about a judge, an Israeli judge, Aaron Barak, who she once, in an introduction to a speech he gave, she said, he's one of my heroes. She then said, I say that a lot. But, you know, she's been questioned about almost anyone she's ever said something nice about. And I think you're right. I think it's a proxy for being able to question her about her own views. You turn around and say, okay, we're going to run down the list of anyone she likes and figure out what's bad about them.
What about Democrats' efforts in these hearings to try to make them about Democrats' judicial philosophy, at least to make them about a Democratic critique of the Roberts Court? Is that working?
Well, it's been, I will say, they're much more coherent than they were last year. You'll remember at the Sotomayor hearings, the Democrats had a tough time getting on the same page about what it is that they think the liberal judicial project is. This year, I think they've, at least from Leahy all the way down to Al Franken, you're hearing the same message, which is Roberts Court, out of touch, pro-corporate, anti-little guy, hates the environment, messing up your drinking water. It's right down the line. Whether it has anything whatsoever to do with Elena Kagan is not clear, but certainly to the extent that they're trying to message a coherent liberal message, which is, hey, the court needs to stand up for the little guy when the other more beholden branches of government are not doing that. I think they're getting that message across, or at very least, they're certainly all doing it as a team, and that's much more effective than last year's kind of scatter.
And how do you think that Kagan is doing thus far as a nominee? Obviously, today was the first day she took questions. It's clear that just from what I saw of the hearings today that she seems very relaxed.
Relaxed, funny. You know, she brought the room to a standstill, just gut-wrenching laughter. At some point, Lindsey Graham asked her, what were you doing when the Christmas Day bomber was caught on Christmas Day? And she said, like pretty much all Jews, I was probably at a Chinese restaurant. And, I mean, you know, people were applauding. She's very funny, Rachel. She's very disarming. But at the same time, I think she does a good job of saying, look, I take the law very seriously. At one point, she was questioned about her passions, and she couldn't get passionate about anything but the law. So she's doing a good job of balancing seriousness and levity and humor, and I think real charm. The thing I really am enjoying this time around is it sometimes feels like these hearings shrink the nominee down to a smaller version of who they are. This is actually letting someone who looks good on paper but is hard to love on paper become quite human and warm and big, luminous smile. And so I don't know if that's working for everyone, but it's quite clear that the senators are finding her disarming and charming and kind of likable.
A likable liberal. Dear me. I know. She won't call herself liberal, but the press is going to have a hard time understanding how to report on this. Dahlia Lithwick, senior editor and legal correspondent for Slate Magazine. I always really appreciate your insight on days like this. Thanks a lot, Dahlia.
Thank you for having me.